Hi and welcome back. This week we're taking an in-depth look at Aperture Priority mode. This is the second aspect of the exposure triangle and the one that controls the amount of light coming into your camera and also the depth of field in your images. If you've only just started learning how to use your camera, you may have noticed that there's a lot of halving or doubling in photography. For example, as we saw in last week's Shutter Priority Challenge, if we change our shutter speed from 1/60th to 1/125th of a second, we halve the amount of light reaching the sensor. Conversely, if we go from 1/60th to 1/30th of a second, we double the amount of light striking the sensor.
As you've probably guessed, the same is also true of aperture values. Now, before we start using the camera in aperture priority mode, let's first take a closer look at the aperture and how it is commonly displayed on our cameras.
Aperture is simply another word for opening, and the aperture system in our lens consists of a series of blades or a diaphragm that opens up or closes down to admit a precise amount of light to strike the sensor. This diaphragm controls the size of the opening, and the size of this aperture in the lens is referred to by an F number.
Now, in and of themselves, these F numbers may appear confusing at first. I mean, when you consider a shutter speed, then 1/60th of a second or 1/125th of a second makes sense because we can visualize that as a measure of time.
Sure.
But what does f5.6 actually mean?
Well, typically a lens will feature a number of available aperture settings, or as we will call them from now on, f-stops, in a range such as this. Starting on this particular lens at f1.4, going through to f2.8, f8, f11, f16 and down to f22. These are all whole F numbers, and it's important to remember that each one represents either a halving or a doubling of the amount of light reaching this camera's sensor. So if I shoot at f8 and then decide to open up the aperture to f5.6, which is of course a wider aperture, then to maintain the same constant exposure, my shutter speed has to double. If it stayed the same, the image would be one stop too bright or brighter. If I shoot at f2.8 and stop down to f4, to maintain the same exposure or brightness in my image, then my shutter speed has to halve. If I didn't change the shutter speed, it would be one stop darker.
Perhaps the easiest way to think about this is to consider what is actually happening at each aperture. For example, if we look at this lens with the aperture opened up to f1.4, then you can barely, if at all, see the aperture blades in the lens. If we close down to f5.6, we start to see the opening in the lens becoming smaller, and f11 becomes smaller still, and so on. Remember, each time we close down the lens one whole F number from say f5.6 to f8, we halve the amount of light reaching the sensor. Each time we open up from say 5.6 to f4, then we double the amount of light that reaches our sensor.
Now, if you're in full manual mode, this is something that you have to compensate for to ensure that your exposure stays the same. If you change the aperture, you also need to change the shutter speed or the ISO. However, today is all about aperture priority mode. So when you change the aperture value on your camera, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed and ISO. Again, we'll look at full manual mode in an upcoming challenge.
Okay, that's great. So what? How does it help with creating interesting images?
Well, let's look at the effect on our image as we change the aperture value. And this is the really exciting part of changing your aperture setting, which is the amount of creative control that it gives you.
So here we have a scene with the camera pointed at a series of beer bottles. I'm using a Canon 5 DSR and a 50mm f1.2 lens. The aperture is set to f1.2, which is also known as wide open. Now notice that if we take a picture, we can see that there is a very shallow depth of field at f1.2. That is, only a very slender portion of the image where we have focused the camera is actually in focus. If I close the lens aperture down to f5.6 and take another shot, then you can see that our depth of field, our zone of what is an acceptable focus, grows. This time I stop down to f11, take another shot, and again we can see that even more of the scene is now in focus. We have a greater depth of field. Stopping the lens down all the way to f16 and taking another shot, and we can see that we have the maximum amount of depth of field that we can get from this particular lens in a single shot. So on this lens, if I start wide open at f1.2, I have a very shallow depth of field. If I close down the aperture to f5.6, then down to f11, then down to f16, my depth of field continues to grow. And at f16 is where I have the greatest possible depth of field from this particular lens. So the point at which I actually focused will be the sharpest point in the image. However, there also exists a zone both in front and behind the point of focus, within which anything falling in this zone will be in acceptable focus. In other words, it will appear sharp. This zone is what we refer to as the depth of field.
So we know that the aperture controls how much is in focus in your image. That is to say how much depth of field there is in your image. By changing my aperture setting, I am controlling the depth of field in my photograph, and so controlling where I want the viewer to look. This is an immensely powerful way of directing the attention, the focus, if you'll excuse the pun, and the emotion of the viewer, and is one of the strongest creative tools available to you as a photographer.
So, okay, enough talk. Today we're heading out to Alfred Nicholas Gardens in the beautiful Dandenong Ranges, whereby we'll each creatively explore different aperture settings while shooting the flowers and the landscape views that are out there. Now, this is not so much a competition between us, it's more of a challenge to ourselves to create a series of 5 images each while exploring the effect of the different aperture values on our images. Now, when we return home, we'll go through our favourite images and our thoughts behind them, so make sure you stick around until the end. And as always, we strongly encourage you to try this challenge for yourselves.
So let's go.
What's in your camera bag for today's aperture challenge?
Today we are with Canon, the R6 Mark II mirrorless. So the body, and I think it's 5 lenses today: 16, 35, 50mm fixed lengths, the 24 to 105, and the 70 to 200 f2.8. So Michael, what's in your kit bag today?
So I'm using the R5 Mark II. I've got this wonderful 70-200 2.8 Z lens on there, which is a cracking lens. I brought a few others with me just to play with. 35 1.4. I've bought both versions of my 50mm, the EF 50 1.2 and the 50 1.8, the cheap version, which is actually a surprisingly good lens. I've bought the 85 1.2, which I'm going to do a little bit of portraiture with as well, of you. So my wide angle is covered by the 16 to 35 2.8. That's it. Okay, so we're back.
Well, we might be back, but do we need to talk about something?
No. We're back and we're looking at our images from yesterday, and we're going to start with yours. Okay, so take me through your images, what you've got here today.
So the first is definitively not so much a composition of any note, but more of an example of what aperture control is all about. So this is using the 70 to 200 lens. The first image is at 2.8, so very, very wide open, shallow depth of field. And you can see the sweet spot where I'm focusing is bang in the middle of the image, and everything else tends to be quite indistinct. And as you then go to the next image, which is at f10, you're going to see far more of the image come into focus. So it's good from the point of view that you're getting access to what's going on in the wider parts of the image, but it's also more chaotic too in terms of, so you've got to be very sure about the aperture control that you're using, or the aperture setting that you're using, is that actually referencing back to what you want to show in your image.
And as the depth of field or the point of focus defines what is your subject in your image as well, you have to then make sure you know what that is when you're shooting, don't you?
Yes.
So moving on to your second set of, this is the leaves that I also have captured at some stage as well. Now, what were you using here?
The 24 to 105.
Yep.
Started off here at f4. I've come in quite close to the leaves on this, but you can see that we really are just isolating the main few leaves in the middle, and the rear of the image is very indistinct. We go out then to, I think it's f7, and you're starting to see that the trees and the shrubbery behind the subject coming into focus a little bit more. Then with the third image, we're out to f22, and it really is quite chaotic. The back of the image is now far more in focus, sunspots, etc. And I think you've lost the drama of that first image.
Talk me through these ones here. So I see shot at f4. What lens were you using?
Again, the 24 to 105.
Yep.
So this is an Acer tree on the right hand side. Not that you can particularly tell the way that the focus is more on the top left hand side of the image, so that you're getting the back of the image more in focus than you are the foreground.
I like this though, because using a shallow depth of field, you've used the foreground images, the red, foreground leaves in red, to create a kind of a frame.
Yes.
And I often do that. It gives a sense of depth to an image. So I'll often position something out of focus in the front of my frame so that it draws the viewer's eye through to where you want them to look.
Yeah.
And you've achieved that using a shallow depth of
Well,
field.
it's quite a chaotic image, and I do believe some people have made garments using this as a...
Really?
Yes.
I must look up the designers
I think
on
you
those.
really have.
Yeah. Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah. Now this is a little iris, I believe. This is a shot at f1.8. So I'm assuming this is your...
This is the 50 mil.
50 mil, yeah.
Yeah. So again, not out to create a wonderful composition as such, but to demonstrate what aperture control can do. So here at 1.8, we're focused right in the middle of the flower head, and the rest of the image is it's soft. It's almost Monet-ish in terms of how the colours are quite muted, and your eye is definitively drawn to the subject.
No question, your eye goes straight to the focus, doesn't
That's
it,
right.
in every image, and I'm drawn straight to the iris. Yeah, and the background, I know what it is, but it's not distracting in any way. It's lovely.
No, it complements what you're looking at, not takes away from it. At f5 now, you're getting a lot more of the background in.
Yep.
Quite chaotic. You don't really know where to look. It's quite a messy image.
Yep.
And then you go all the way out to f22, and as you've explained previously, that's almost what an iPhone image will do.
Yeah.
It will capture everything, lovely front to back.
Yeah.
But in terms of a composition, you don't know where to look. It's not saying anything.
No.
So
I mean, that just looks like a snap, whereas that looks like a well-conceived image, doesn't it? I mean, that's the difference with the depth of fields. Yeah. And your final set of images. Okay. Oh, now this was using your 16, the RF16, the inexpensive lens, fantastic little lens. Yeah. Here we're shot
3.2
at f3.2. Yep.
So I shot at 3.2, at 7.1, and at 22. What I've learnt with this particular lens, because it's a wide open prime landscape lens, is even at those three different settings, you're not getting much difference in the front to back separation. So we're focusing bang on the middle of the bridge, but still, even at the smallest aperture here, or the widest aperture, the back of the image is still quite in focus.
Yeah, I mean, that's to do with your apparent perceived depth of field.
Yes.
I mean, f2.8 is f2.8, whether you're on a 16mm or a 70-200 or a 85mm, but the apparent depth of field, your perceived view of the depth of field, is that it doesn't change that much because you're looking at such a wide scene as such. But it's interesting to notice if you come up to the side of the leaves here.
That's about the only place in the three images that you can see a slight difference, and to me it really is only slight between the different aperture values.
Well, it's the sort of lens you'd use for landscapes, isn't it?
Yes.
And if the one thing it does demonstrate is that if you're wanting to include foreground and background details in focus, then stopping down your lens will help you to achieve that, and that's really what we've come through from
well
there.
said, yeah.
So this first set of shots were also taken with my inexpensive 50mm RF lens.
Yep.
Fabulous little lens for what it costs. These images, if you notice, starting here at f1.2, this is wide open, so all your attention is drawn to the flower. The background is rendered very, very out of focus. It's a very shallow depth of field
You know
image.
where to look.
You do. The issue with this image is that even at 1.2, the depth of field is so shallow that if you zoom in, you notice that you don't really see much detail in the flower. Contrast this with when I stopped down. Here I'm at f3.2, just stopping down to 3.2, and you're getting more detail in the flower. And that, to me, is much more of the sweet spot for this type of image with this lens. Here I've now stopped down to 5.6, and you can see the background is sort of growing into the image. Excuse the plant pun there, but you do see more of the detail in the background. You can make out individual branches and so on. Going now down to f11, the background is far more intrusive. Still okay, it's still out of focus enough to make it a pleasing image, I think. But then at f22, I'm sort of getting to that point where I really don't know where to look, and it's far too...
It's like a Hawaiian shirt. It's very chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, who would wear something like that?
I don't know.
Now, my second series of shots, this was to illustrate... Here I'm shooting with the 16 to 35mm lens. This shot is similar to your 16mm lens. I'm at the 16mm end of the spectrum. I'm shooting here at f2.8. I go over to the next shot, which is at f8, and the next shot, which is at f22.
Yeah.
Now, even on the screen at first glance, you don't see that much difference. But let's go back to the f2.8 and zoom in on the bridge. When we do so, the bridge appears nice and sharp, and there's a good deal of contrast in there. F8, it's still showing the same amount of contrast, slightly more depth of field. Things are a little bit crisper around the edge of the flowers and the plants, and etc. But when I get down to f22, this is where I start to run into problems. And I've got what's called diffraction showing in my image. Now, diffraction is when light passes through a really stopped down, narrow pinhead, if you like, or pinhole of the aperture. The light waves, which don't travel in straight lines, they bounce around off the edge of the aperture blades at the opening, and they cause a lack in sharpness and a lack in contrast, or a loss of sharpness and a loss of contrast, I should say. And you might also notice that highlights tend to get a bit of a sort of a softy fog glow around them. And it is this lack of sharpness and lack of contrast and that slight foggy feel around highlights that mean I very rarely shoot stopped right down to f22. It's simply not worth the loss in image quality. And that's why you'll often hear photographers talking about a lens's sweet spot, which in the instance of this older lens, this is an older version 2 of the EF 16 to 35, would be around the 5.6 to f8 version. Yeah. That's when I'm getting the most out of the lens. I'm not getting diffraction coming into play, and it's as crisp as an image as I'm going to get with the maximum sort of depth of field. So then that leads on to the next question. If you're wanting a maximum depth of field in an image, what do you do if you can't stop down to f22? Well, in this instance, what I would do is I would take several images at different areas of focus within the image. So
stack them up.
Yeah, I would shoot. So for the foreground, I'd focus there. I'd then focus in the midground, and I'd focus in the background, and I'd then stack those 3 images together in Photoshop to get me the maximum depth of field with the crispest possible image. Again, that's for another time. We're just talking about apertures for the moment. But it is important to be aware of the downside of stopping right down. In this next series of images, this is of a little Chinese sculpture here, and I've stopped this right down to f22 to illustrate that what happens to out of focus highlights when you stop right down is you get that starburst effect. Yeah. And that's the aperture blades causing that. This is at f22. If you go to f2.8, you'll notice that not only do you have very little in focus in the image, it's a very shallow plane of focus here, but your out of focus highlights are far more of a simple blob. You don't have that indistinct feel to them. So in this instance, yeah, I would get away with shooting at f22. This is the one that you shot as well. This is the, I got actually underneath it here, and I'm shooting at f2.8.
20 acres of gardens, and you choose the same plant.
I had to do the same, but I didn't actually notice you'd taken this.
Wow.
So shooting at f2.8, looking up, you'll notice again the highlight is fairly indistinct. I still like it, but it's not that starburst effect, which you do get if you then stop down to f11. Here you're getting far more of that starburst effect, and of course I'm getting a greater depth of field in my image.
Yes.
Stopping down to f22, you'll notice that it may not even be perceptible on the YouTube video, but there is a lack of contrast here as well, which is again caused by diffraction. So you can do it, you will get an image, but you're going to get far more in the way of issues with lack of contrast and grain in the shot.
It wasn't caused by you falling over backwards while you were taking the image?
No. So moving on to the last set of images, which is of the boat shed. Here I'm using the 16 to 35mm lens at the 35mm end of the spectrum. And I've shot here at 2.8. I go down to 5.6. Notice the highlight of the sun in the sky. You'll notice here if I go down to f11, the starburst effect grows even more, and f22 it's even more pronounced. But diffraction is still causing me the same issues. If I look at the boat shed at 2.8, the boat shed looks lovely and crisp, clean, and there's a good deal of contrast in here. When I get down to f22, it's a lot flatter. The whole image appears flatter. Now I haven't adjusted these in post, this is just as is. But you can see it is flatter, isn't it? And because I've stopped the lens right down, I've stopped a lot of light coming to the lens, so my ISO of course increases, and the penalty I pay is in increased noise or grain, and you do get that lack of sharpness as well. So that was my 5, but I just wanted to finish as we did last week with some other shots that we took, which is I used my lovely 85mm lens designed for portraiture. This is the EF version, came out in 2006, and I just wanted to do a series of shots of Mark to illustrate how changing your aperture directs the viewer's eye when shooting something like a portrait. So here I've shot at f1.2, and you'll notice I've deliberately left a fair bit of background here so that you can see what happens to the out of focus highlights. And you've got a lovely sort of bokeh effect in the background there, a lovely smooth bokeh effect.
And quite sensible clothing too.
Quite sensible clothing, a handsome subject, there you go. And this is at f1.2. Now notice the out of focus highlights, how they change as I stop down. This is at f2. And then we go on to f2.8. That background is starting to come more into focus in the image as the depth of field grows. Then we go down to f5.6, and it's quite a considerable difference between those two aperture values, I feel. You'll notice the background becomes far more intrusive to an extent. Then we go down to f11. For some reason I jumped and missed f8, one whole f-stop. So this is at f11, and you'll notice the background is even more in focus here. And by the time we reach f16, which is the maximum aperture value of this particular lens, not only has, of course, my ISO increased, but the background is far more intrusive.
Very distracted.
And am I looking at the subject or am I looking at the background? It's not the way I want to shoot a portrait. So for me, traditionally, I would shoot 2.8, 3.5, something like that for a nice, pleasing portrait with a shallow depth of field.
And separation from all the distractions behind.
That's exactly right. So that's it for today's video. We hope you've enjoyed watching. Apologies for the shirt before he says it. We'd like you to, if you can, try this challenge for yourself. I believe they can put the images up on our Facebook page.
Brought in focus Facebook,
Yeah, so please do try that. If you like what you've seen today, if you have any comments at all on anything we've covered, please do comment and like the video, obviously, but leave a comment below, and we'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Like, subscribe. If you have any serious comments about what we've chosen to wear, we'd love to hear those too. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you then.
Thank you.